Hello, and welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast, brought to you by the Malfers Group team, where each week we tackle important, actionable topics to help churches thrive. And now, here's your hosts, Scott Ball and AJ Matthew.
Hey, welcome to episode 60 of the Church Revitalization Podcast. My name is AJ, and that's Scott over there, as usual. Hey, Scott.
Hello, AJ Matthew. How are you, my friend?
I'm awesome as I don't want to say as usual, but I'm frequently awesome. Feeling.
I love it.
So the title this week is Bailing on Bad Polity, and this is a two-parter, so that we're bringing you the first of two. Next week, we'll be catching up the other half of this. And this week, we're talking 3 challenges to better polity. 3 challenges. So today, we'll be looking at the things that are maybe creating some tough situations in your church from a polity perspective. And next week, we're going to talk about some things we can do to move beyond that and some improvements that can be made. I'm surprised we haven't really talked polity prior to now, Scott, because it comes up a lot. And
all the time.
Probably like, I don't know, 110% of the churches we work with, there's something having to do with polity that has held them back or caused some frustration or issues or lack of health or growth. And I'm sure probably maybe this will be like us just kind of nudging the door open. And I there's several areas in here I think we'll probably go deeper on in future episodes.
I mean, have you ever left a church leadership meeting and it just made you want to quit church? I mean, that's the problem we really want to solve today. And or over the course of this 2-part series on bailing on bad polity. I mean, we are supposed to be the people of good news, and yet when that elder board or committee team meeting pops up on your calendar, it couldn't feel like worse news. And that's really tragic, right? For the people of God, that we feel so badly about going to something that should not make us feel that way. And I want you to know it doesn't have to be that way. And so I don't think, though, that we can really address the solution to bad polity without fully comprehending the challenges that you're facing when you need to change bad polity. So that's why we want to focus first sort of on the problems before next week we tackle the solutions. Because if we don't really understand the nuances of why our polity isn't working in the first place and the challenges you're going to have to overcome in order to change it, then we're not going to be able to change it. So
Let's jump into the first challenge, and that's the past. And there's really sort of 2 sides to this, and we're talking about, what your present structure is and maybe how you got there. And so on some cases, Scott, we've got like maybe even more mainline denominations, but even others, there's just there is documented, book of order or other types of sort of church structure manuals. But then on the other side, we've got a whole other thing from the past, and that's simply precedent and tradition and history.
yeah, so I think there's usually churches are coming from one side of this or the other. You either are in a more mainline denomination that has rules for you on how you must be structured. I worked long time ago. Didn't grow up Presbyterian. Grew up in a Bible church, actually, but worked for a short period of time when I was in college in a Presbyterian church and learned all about, a church session and all this. And this is all old hat for those of you who serve in those kinds of traditions. And there's just not a lot of flexibility, AJ, in terms of how you're going to structure the leadership of your individual church. On the other side, as you mentioned, there's churches that are more independent or perhaps come from a tradition where there's a lot of freedom, and churches can create their own, are free to create their own structures, but they also have constraints on them that are not written in a book of order, but they're sort of written on their hearts in terms of tradition, right? Well, we've always done it this way, and you certainly may have some constitution or bylaws that make you do things a certain way, but those are reflections of their traditions, not necessarily anything external that's telling them it has to be this way. That's just what they've always done. And you're going to have to confront that.
Yeah, I think a lot of churches might sit there and maybe, even the constraints that they have, the documented constraints they have, Probably subconsciously might even be a little bit overwhelming or feel like there is no flexibility. But if you're really, like, hey, you know what? We've kind of done it this way, but we don't have to.
Yeah.
And there's some
Churches that aren't made to structure in a particular way, but just have done it for a long time in a particular way. They feel the same way, AJ. They feel like we can't change it. This is, we've had the committee on committees, the committee to nominate the people on committees. I mean,
right.
they feel like it's this mammoth thing that can never be changed. So, I mean, there might not be any book that tells them it has to be this way, but they feel the same pressure, I think. Sometimes worse.
And it's really interesting. You can see it both ways. I mean, I've worked with churches where the Constitution was very vague and open, and they've created like some real rigid thing just out of practice that they don't have to do. And then the other side, like even independent churches that have really detailed constitutions.
Yeah.
And I mean, I worked with a church, their constitution prescribed what time Sunday morning service was. I'm like, well, that's a little tough to get around,
So next week, we're going to talk about some structural changes that we would recommend in the next episode. But in this episode, I want to focus a little bit on how do you navigate this challenge? So we've talked at length now about sort of the extremes on what those constraints where they may be rooted in, but how do you navigate them? Every pastor knows, who's ever tried to change anything, knows that you can't just walk into a committee meeting or a council meeting or a board meeting and say, well, we're doing this now. That never works. That is a long walk down a short plank. Is that what they say? And so you don't want to do that. So how do you start that process, and how do you navigate the challenge? And I believe that the key component here is to walk into it humbly and in a way that honors the past. You're just not going to get very far by launching bombs at the past and saying, well, this was terrible. I can't believe we've always done it this way. This is dysfunctional and this is wrong. I mean, that is just a great way to get fired. The best way forward, in my view, is to try to identify or single out what were the original intentions of the structure that were created. I don't think that anybody ever created a church structure and go, let's find the most dysfunctional way we could structure a church, and let's do that. So let's take, for example, a church that is committee based, that's got 12 committees. What do you think the heart behind that was originally?
Yeah, they thought, wow, we'll break this up into, like just little niche detail things. And that way we'll be able to really accomplish a lot by, not making, one group of people make all the decisions. And
it'll activate more people into the ministry, right? It'll give more ownership.
Everybody's participating and speaking into it.
Right. So I think that what you could do is then acknowledge, hey, the reason why we were structured this way back in 1897 was that the founders of this church wanted for us to live out the priesthood of all believers, and for us to live out Ephesians 4 and live out this idea that all of us are to own the ministry and not just the pastor. But here's the reality. So point out the intention of the original structure, and then point the reality of the structure and go, well, the reality now is that this is not a decision-making committee. This is a discussion-based group, right? They have discussions. They don't make decisions. And when you're able to then communicate, here's a way that we could do this that honors the intention of our structure. I think I'm not suggesting it's going to be easy by any means, AJ, but lobbing bombs at the past won't work.
This is very closely related to how we speak about vision even. I mean, you don't get people on board for something better by beating up what's current. I mean, if you show somebody a better thing, they'll come to their own conclusion that, oh, what we have right now isn't that. I would rather have that good thing that you're describing to me.
People who have been a part of something for a long time have gone nose blind, so to speak, to the stink of the current situation.
Yeah.
And so you do have to kind of take them out of the space for a minute and then bring them back in and say, do you smell that now? And And that's a hard, I mean, I'm not suggesting that this is an easy conversation to have or that you can have at one time and people are going to be on board. It's very likely a process that's going to take lots of conversation, but it is important to acknowledge the past,
Yeah.
but also don't let that prevent you from painting a better picture for the future.
You'll certainly have people that will immediately have a sigh of relief and go, "Oh my gosh, thank you. That'll be so much better." And then
Right.
others that will just dig their heels in and say,
Sure.
"Nothing should be changed. This is how we've always done it. It works fine." So,
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
with any significant change in the church, there's always going to be those two sort of ends that come up. Challenge number 2 to a polity change is the need for democracy. And
Mhm.
I love this. I love this topic. I'm surprised in myself that I like this point so much, Scott. I mean, I am so patriotic, freedom loving. I see a distinction in what a healthy church polity
Yeah.
should look like
Mm.
versus a healthy nation.
Mm.
And so I think this is like a super necessary point, and I don't know, maybe it's timely also for just for a nasty political climate,
Yeah.
and so much discussion even just in culture right now between the church and the election, or just politics in general in the church. But the point
Yeah. Don't worry.
here,
We're not going to tell you who to vote for. We're
we're,
not talking
we're
about that.
absolutely not.
No.
We are going to tell you though that we've got too much democracy in the church. Let me just throw that bomb out
Yeah.
there.
Oof. What a tough thing to say, but it's so true.
Yeah.
So much of our polity is primarily modeled, and this is, let me stop and say, this is, if you're listening to this and you're in some other country, this may not resonate with you.
Great point. I
Um,
meant to say that before we got into challenge number 2, and because we do have a very broad listenership and viewership, and so
yeah.
yeah, this is a very Western slash American, North
Yeah.
American
Maybe even
concept.
more specifically in the US. I'm not even sure that you see these same kinds of problems in Canada, although maybe you do. I'm not for certain.
Yeah, we're
Um,
probably the extreme in this regard. So
Definitely, most assuredly the extreme. Yes.
yeah,
And it's this idea that we have to vote on everything. I mean, even churches that are not congregational churches. So, I mean, if your thought is, well, we're not a congregational church, so we don't have to worry about that. Well, I mean, you got to think. uh, Okay, I'll go back to the church that I worked at in college. AJ was a Presbyterian church, and that session, um, which is sort of the governing body in a Presbyterian church, was not small. I don't want to be inaccurate and say how many people served on the session, but it was not a small group of
they're
people,
usually pretty good sized. Yeah,
pretty good sized. And um,
I don't really
man,
know.
they
Good,
voted.
large.
Yeah, I mean they voted. They
Yeah.
voted on stuff. So it was still pretty democratic, even within that group. And we're not suggesting that voting on things is wrong. I mean, every boards vote on things. We're not railing against voting in particular,
Yeah. Yeah.
but but democratizing decision making is not a biblical way of approaching leadership. It's just not.
Hmm.
We have to acknowledge that. That's an uncomfortable truth for us. Um, that might make you uncomfortable and may make you want to turn off this podcast, but it's just the truth. It is not a biblical way to do leadership, AJ. In
Yeah.
fact, usually there are instances of democracy, not the term, but sort of the function, in the Bible, and it's usually a cautionary tale,
Well, they certainly cried out for a king
right?
together
Yeah,
with a
we want a
loud
king.
voice. Yeah.
And God says, "You don't know what you're talking about." Yeah,
Yeah.
they wanted to go
Uh,
back to Egypt,
yeah, right. The 12 spies come back, took
right? They voted.
control. Yeah. Yeah. Let's see where we're at. And the majority won or lost. I'm not sure what the majority ended up with in the end.
Yeah, dead is what they ended up. Dead in the wilderness, right? So,
The vote that killed 10 in a generation.
a
Yes.
whole generation.
Yeah.
Yeah, a whole generation died based on that vote.
Yep.
Even the crowds abandoned Jesus, right? Think about that. Think about Jesus's crucifixion itself.
Screaming
Pontius Pilate stands
crowd.
before him
Yep.
and says, "You've got Barabbas, who's a murderer,
Yeah.
and Jesus, who should I release? Release to us Barabbas, Barabbas,
Yeah.
release to us Barabbas." And so all of that to say, voting in the Bible is generally not looked at as like the way to go, as uncomfortable as that makes us feel.
Yeah.
So what is a bit more biblical approach? If
Well,
democracy isn't it, what is it? How does God do leadership in the Bible, and what are the differences?
yeah. Well, God certainly, we see lots of examples in which structures were put in place for decision making. Moses and Jethro. Which we started off with Moses only sort of sitting as judge, and then they expanded that because the church Israel was large and had lots of needs, and so we had people then placed over thousands and hundreds and fifties and tens,
Right.
but there was still kind of an authority structure there in place. So there's kind of one thing. Um, I love, Scott, we talked before we got on this. I love in Acts, the choosing of kind of the first seven deacons.
Yep.
So the apostles were in place as the governing board of the Jerusalem church.
Uh-huh.
And we don't see any evidence in scripture that they were calling for votes on everything from all the people.
No.
They were making decisions, and then they placed people in other leadership positions beneath
Yeah,
them.
appointed. Yeah,
Yeah.
you if you wanna kinda just boil it down to this base point, AJ, biblical leaders are appointed, not elected.
Yeah.
They're appointed
We see that all
or
over.
or anointed, right?
Yeah, there you go.
They're, certainly appointed, they're not elected.
Yeah.
You see this even in, I believe it's Acts chapter 3, where, um, we actually you and I had not a debate, but sort of a discussion about, should the apostles even have done this? But when, one of the first order of business after Jesus ascends to heaven is for the apostles to replace Judas and go, okay, who's going to fill that 12th seat? And so they had a few criteria, some what we might call core competencies that they were looking for, and identified, I believe, two different men to fill that seat.
Mhm.
And then, did they call for a vote?
They did not call for a vote, unless you want to call casting lots a call
No,
for
they
a vote.
cast lots.
They
They
asked God to vote, I suppose, is the way they saw it.
That's how they saw it.
There
Yeah,
you
they saw it
go.
as God votes.
Yeah.
You could make a theological argument, I think, although it'd be hotly contested, maybe, that God repudiates sort of their choice to even go through this process by his appointment of Paul as an apostle.
Yeah.
And like this is the 12th apostle that God selected. So it's even less democratic, right? Like it's even further away. Like he picked the last person that the apostles ever, they would even have nominated Paul, right? They would have been like, not that guy, anybody but that guy, right?
Yeah.
And so it just boils down to this. When it comes to biblical leadership, God appoints, and we have a tendency to want to elect it.
Yeah.
And it's much more of a theocracy than a democracy when it comes to God. And so I don't think that there's any tension, AJ, or needs to be, between recognizing that when it comes to human government, democracy is a good thing. But when it comes to spiritual leadership, sort of God's design for that is better. And I don't think that we need to try to shoehorn American or Western ideals into. There doesn't need to be a democratization
Mhm.
of church leadership.
Yeah.
Um,
And we're not trying to take you to like some extreme over here. We're
no,
like, nothing should ever be voted on. Nobody should ever be elected to any particular thing. That's
of
not at
course not.
all what we're saying. This is take a 30,000-foot view of this. Maybe,
Correct.
examine your polity. And again, this could come back to like, committee on committees and all these things, or,
Uh-huh.
how people get placed into committees. I mean, lots of churches have a congregational vote on adding committee members and things like that.
Yeah.
And, kind of zoom out a little bit and take another view of that and think, does this really feel like it lines up with what we see, as examples in scripture? Or maybe is there a healthier way to go about this to get the right people in the right place? So,
I mean, listen, AJ and I are both well aware of how the sausage gets made in a lot of churches. And I know the politicking, literally politicking, that has to happen to make certain things happen in the church. That, you got to take this guy out to lunch and you got to make promises that this is going to go this way. And you got to win some financial support from this guy to, because if he's got some money behind it, then it's going to pass. And and just take a step back from that and look at scripture and go, is that at all in line with what we see in scripture of how leadership does things? Like, does that even make you feel, does that give you the warm fuzzies at all? Or does it make you feel a little bit sick that you got to know, man, I got to know what the vote's going to be on this thing before I bring it to the table?
yeah,
Think about that. Like, nothing about that is a spiritual process.
sounds a lot like government.
It sounds a ton like government, because it is.
Get the votes behind the scenes, then let's go public with it. Let's win
Right.
this.
Yeah, you've got that guy on your board or your elder board or your deacon board who's the whip, who's going to get the votes. Like that, that's just not, it's just not good. And so, yeah, you'd much rather decisions be made based on vision, based on scripture, based on prayer, based on thoughtfulness. And some of the most important decisions that were ever made by spiritual leaders and by leaders in the church were unpopular. They were unpopular.
Yeah.
But they were right.
Yeah.
And if you aren't structured in a way that enables your leadership to make right but unpopular decisions, you'll never be fully healthy. That's just a fact. All that to say, I think that when it comes to navigating this challenge, if you're going, well, how do we dismantle or how do we shift away from this? I think that it's important to acknowledge that you're going to have to spend not a little bit of time, maybe lots and lots of time, teaching scripture, teaching about leadership from a biblical perspective, and go, let's do a biblical theology of leadership. If you're not familiar with the term biblical theology, a biblical theology means we're going to take a theme, which is, say, leadership, and we're going to trace leadership from Genesis to Revelation. What can we learn by doing a full reading of the whole Bible, or a survey, so to speak, of the Bible on leadership? What do we learn about leadership, and what does the Bible say? And most of us, I don't think, have done the real heart work, AJ, of confronting the topic of something like leadership.
Yeah, you'll likely drop very few verses into the democracy bucket.
Almost zero.
Yeah. All right, man, let's move on to our challenge number 3, and that's the talent pool. And this is a good, I think, third point to this, because we've been this has been, I think, a question maybe lingering in the ether on our last 2 challenges. And right now in a lot of structures, where it requires a lot of people, in committees and things like that.
Yeah.
Especially even smaller churches, you might have a church of 100 people and you've got a dozen committees, that make up 30% of the church. Is the talent pool really there to that the best person is in the best seat?
Yes. Yeah. So just to be clear, the third challenge is your talent pool might be a challenge.
Your talent pool might be a challenge. Absolutely. People see this, and this could be an elephant in the room in your church. As a matter of fact, the talent pool can't support the level of leadership. And so reducing the quantity of leaders might up your game. Your performance might increase if we reallocate the roles and have those not suited to be in the position serving in another capacity, maybe in a non-decision making role and more of just a functional role. So
if you were to raise the bar, so to speak, on what biblical leadership means and looks like, you may look around your church and realize you don't have a single person who's qualified right now. AJ, you and I actually were just having a coaching meeting with someone not that long ago who said exactly this. They said, and I look around my church and I go, I don't have a single elder. I don't have a single person who I would feel comfortable elevating to this position. And so your talent pool very likely is a challenge. The mistake that churches make is that they tend to elevate leaders based on longevity and seniority. They just go, well, they've been here a long time. They've been a part of the church for a long time. And there is usually at least a cursory nod towards the pastoral epistles where you're going, all right, well, this guy's not been divorced 17 times, so that's good, you know. But not much. I mean, I'm not trying to denigrate anybody, but it's not necessarily a super high bar for a lot of people to hit. And worse, AJ, churches will often elevate people because of their influence or status.
Yeah.
They have money, they run a business, whatever. I think that you have to recognize that your church's talent pool might be shallow when you initially make shifts in your polity.
Yeah.
But
I spoke with a pastor just about a month ago out in a Western state, and he was definitely feeling this. They were in sort of a rebuilding, revitalization season right now, and just felt like he had just almost nobody that would be able to be elevated to a position of elder. And it left him in our discussion really similar maybe to like a church plant situation, right, Scott? Where you've going to have to take some time and raise people's level before you're going to be able to truly fill these roles that are going to be necessary in the church going forward to be healthy. And that may be where you are today. You might have to, there might be some groundwork that has to happen before you could really make a significant change. And that's raising people's level before they can serve in these areas.
But if you're in a small church, 100 people or whatever, and you're looking around and you're going, man, we just don't have very many leaders. My encouragement here is to take the long view on this and go, okay, let's maybe our ideal size is a 7 pastor elder board, but right now we only have the pastor and 2 other people who are qualified. Take the long view. Have 3 elders for a season, and then work really hard on elevating some people and growing them and investing in them and seeing them mature and raise up their level of competency and make leadership development really key and integral to the life of your church, which we'll talk more about next week. But take the long view and don't bail on implementing good polity just because you don't have the leaders right now. Start building them up, start raising them up, and just understand that it might take more than 6 months for you to have the right leaders in place.
There you go. I think that's going to be a wrap on our discussion on the challenges in church polity, and we'll be back again next week with the exciting conclusion, Scott.
That's right. We're gonna outline for you 3 action steps that you can take to put in good polity. So bail on bad polity and implement some good polity.
Thanks for joining us. This has been episode 60 of the Church Revitalization Podcast, and you can read today's show notes at malfersgroup.com/60, the number 60. Also be links in there for you to subscribe and also watch the video version of this on YouTube, because you could actually watch us while we talk. That might be fun or scary. But thanks for being with us. We sure do appreciate it. We'll be back with you again next week. So we'd love for you to share this with somebody that you think it might be helpful for.
Smash that like button.
Don't smash
Click on that notification bell.
We're happy with you just gently clicking. That's how we are. Thanks, everybody.
That's so good. All right, we'll see you next week.